Do you remember the first time you ever experienced culture shock? And what do I mean about culture shock? So culture would be if I grew up in this family, or if I worked in this organization, or grew up in this country, and I go to another country, and they do things very differently. And I don't get rewarded for fixed time, for example. I get rewarded for fluid time in this country. Shock is that feeling we have where we feel really vulnerable and we feel very paralyzed because people are not rewarding us for the same thing that happens in one business unit or one national culture to another. That feeling of paralysis and almost depression that we go through. The honeymoon is over, and now we need to lead and manage and perform in that kind of state of being. Well, I remember the first time this ever happened to me. I felt so lucky as a 25-year-old, having grown up in Midwest United States, very Germanic American, and I had a chance to work and to live in Roatan, Honduras. Very Caribbean. So I had this opportunity to be a manager of the kitchen, the dining room, the waiters, the housekeeping, and I just thought I was the luckiest person in the world. I was so jazzed for this experience. And then I ran into this fixed versus fluid time, and this being versus doing in a situation, and task versus relationship, and I really started to feel depressed. And I was starting to crave being back in the US, being back in the law firm where I had worked before. And you ever have this happen where you start missing all the old things that you actually tried to get away from? And now you're actually wishing for it again. So I had one incident that was such a shock for me because I was trying to manage my employees. I had 35 employees, and we had about 70 guests that would come from around the world to this resort every week. So I was in charge of managing them, and the resort was owned by some Hondurans, and also by a family from Bonaire. The woman in this family, her name is Alice, and she's originally from Miami. And their job was to come every quarter just to see how we were doing on operations. So picture this. Imagine we're sitting in Roatan, Honduras, in the Caribbean, and we're sitting at an open-air table like this, and all the walls are open because we're looking out over the reef and the jungle and the hibiscus and the bamboo growing all around us. Alice had a meeting with me and my 6 waiters. They're all Carib black men. They all had cruise ship experience, and we had a wonderful experience with working with each other. So we were all sitting at this open-air table, looking out over the reef. Are any of you divers? You know that after breakfast, everybody takes off and they go diving? Well, it's nice and quiet on the resort after that. So we have our meetings then. So Alice was sitting there talking with us, and she basically was getting extremely coercive in her language and her approach with us. And it started to get intense, and I started to feel very uncomfortable with the way she was talking to us, to all of us. And at one point, she said, I would like you boys to go out there and cut some of those hibiscus and cut some of those bamboo stalks and make some vases for the tables. I was just paralyzed, the way she was talking to them. And I was looking down at myself. You need to say something? You need to do something? I'm looking at myself. I'm completely paralyzed. I didn't say a word. Finally, Heston, one of the waiters, stood up. And he said, ma'am, you don't talk to us like that. We are grown men. We are not boys. We have families. We have jobs. We have paychecks. I would appreciate it if you wouldn't talk to us like that. And he sat back down. And I looked at that, and I saw that he was a descendant of slaves in the Caribbean area. He did not ever see himself in servitude. He was in a service business, descendant of slaves, never saw himself in servitude. And I thought to myself, why can I not advocate for my employees? Why can I not advocate for myself when somebody uses coercive power with me? And because my paralyzing method, my lack of performance, my vulnerability in that situation, I could not speak up. I could not handle this kind of situation. So I say, why do we get into culture shock, and how can we overcome this kind of paralysis that happens? Because it's largely unconscious. When it happens to us, we start to feel vulnerable. The other is, how do we respond to people who use coercive strategies when we try to negotiate with them? And that is what started my journey of my career. So what I would like to do is to hear from you, what are the ways that you have identified your culture shock, and how have you found your ways to increase your power and leverage as a negotiator, even in the most uncertain and the most coercive kinds of situations. And I would like to share with you what I have learned in the 25 years I've been physically sitting in libraries, interviewing people, teaching classes around the world. I have learned a lot about what are some of those elements, especially as women, as we work in a world where there is this component around coercive power. So I went and started a PhD track, and I went into political science, international relations, and we studied power and self-interest in international relations. So what I found was pretty fascinating was we learn a lot in political science all about observable behavior. Power is the ability to get someone to do something they necessarily would not do. And it's functional and rational to get others to be a little afraid of you, to coerce them, to do something that you need them to do. And I became really fascinated with that concept. It's functional and rational to behave very self-interested, because this is a way, on an emotional level, we protect ourselves. And when we think analytically, all of our strategies have to be focused around how do I protect myself, advocate for myself, advocate for my business unit or my national culture. So the more that I learned about this in political science, the more I didn't understand. I became very interested then in conflict. And our understanding around conflict, and the reason why we use coercive behavior, is that we live in a world of limited resources. We have limited time, limited budgets, limited opportunities. Therefore, it's functional and rational to minimize our maximum loss, to protect ourselves, and to manipulate others, to use stealth, have no mercy on others, because we need to protect ourselves. I just scratched my head on that. This is so interesting. I don't see that this is always very effective. And then I came into the world of political psychology. And what I learned about self-interest there was, it's not the limited resources per se that creates conflict, it's our perception of it. In fact, that's not the reality. The reality in social situations, my self-interest is linked with yours. In a relationship, in a business unit, in a national government, I actually shift, according to social and political psychologists, I move from egoism to sociocentrism. That I actually change my mindset, that I am not isolated and separate from you, but I am actually part of your interest, and that we will both do better if we work together. So then I started my journey on the world of self-interest and socio-self-interest. And then I learned that when we come up against those who have very different cultural beliefs and value systems that we have, it's not very easy to think that we are in relationship to each other. You just don't understand that we need to be on time. You don't understand that we need to stay focused on the task. And how do we build working trust with each other if under the iceberg we are thinking they are not very smart, they're not very professional, they're not able to meet the needs that we have in our organization? So they start to create more conflict, and they behave in ways that even intensify the conflict. So I became very interested then in how can we learn more about our own cultural preferences, so when I do go into a new cultural setting, I don't have this shock hit me on a subconscious level, that I can actually be aware that this is taking place. I was surprised when I learned that this is actually quite normal. To actually have the honeymoon end and you're in this shock, and then there are steps we take to increase our performance, our levels of confidence, and the curiosity about learning how to deal, to work, and to negotiate with others. So when I use the word negotiation, let's talk a little bit about that definition. I like to think of negotiation as any time you have something that you want and you have to work with others in order to get it. And not every management or social situation is a place where we need something from someone else. However, when you have to start engaging with someone else in order to get what you want, you are in a negotiation situation. So if I'm a buyer and you're a seller, I need to work for you in order to get what I want. If I'm labor and you're management, I have to work for you in order to get what I want. Husband, wife, we have to work through each other in order to get what we want. So if you can think of any time in your life situation, probably right now, maybe going back to work, you have a situation where there's something that you need and you have to work through others in order to get it. We're going to talk a little bit about the techniques of strategy so you can get what you want, even if your value systems are very different than the other. How can we accept our own diversity, engage that diversity, and actually accomplish more of what we want? So we're going to talk a little bit about what are some of the steps that we can take in order to do that. So think of a case where you're trying to achieve something that you want, and you're working through others in order to get it. The most fascinating piece to me is to know who you are. I know this hasn't been called to be a self-help group here this afternoon, but I see that all of these really interesting and productive searches into who we are is one of the most critical sources of leverage we have in any negotiation situation. So we're going to look at how you can understand more of yourself, which gives you more leverage, which allows you to understand others more, and then they will help you accomplish what you need. It's a very interesting process, much more powerful than the power of coercion. So we're going to look a little bit at that. Some of the things that we do in the coursework, both in our academic programs, in executive programs, and consulting programs, is to spend some time building cultural intelligence. And what we often think of is, what kind of knowledge do I need to know about the norms in your business setting, in your national cultural setting? Is there some knowledge about the way things operate there, the practices that are rewarded, the practices that are not rewarded? What is expected? How can I do my due diligence to not walk into that situation believing they all operate and reward the same things that the last unit rewarded me for? So that's the first. To have knowledge, and many times these are called implicit. Those rules, you can see something's going on and you can't quite figure out what it is. There's some underlying rules in terms of who's getting rewarded. How do you actually come to be reinforced with some project or ideas or values that you have? And the other, as I was saying, in terms of really getting to know who we are, we're finding in the science of emotional and social intelligence, that ability to be mindful of your own cultural preferences or your own belief systems, then to be mindful and observe and not judge another's cultural preference. How can I have this kind of mindfulness so I can behave in a more productive, constructive, satisfying way? So, of course, in education we spend a lot of time on knowledge, I think this is a new movement I see in education in the years I've been doing this, is a much more attention on mindfulness and self-awareness, and what kind of impact this has for true business or government performance. And then lastly is, there are some new ways that we need to behave. How can I style switch or change my behavior so I can build more working trust with those who actually think quite differently than I do? How can I actually become rewarded and trusted? By matching the style. So if I'm very fixed time, for example, how can I become more comfortable with fluid time? So we're using a technology or an assessment tool, and I think some of you are aware of our cultural orientation indicator tool, which I find is a very interesting movement in business and in education and in government today, is that because of what we've learned through anthropology, lots of very deep research over time about the way we are very similar and different from each other on various dimensions. So one things we do is help you personally, individually, take an assessment tool, and we can look at, basically, think about the iceberg. Why do you behave in certain ways? In your social settings and with others in a social environment, what are you really attached to in terms of the way you interchange with others? Are you more cooperative, more competitive? Then we look under the iceberg in terms of how you think. What are some of the ways that your intellect works? So for example, are you a very deductive thinker? You like to see the big picture first? Or are you more inductive thinker? You like to take one thing at a time, experiment with something before you build a long, broad theory. And then we take a look at the emotional level, your sense of yourself. What can we learn from looking at your own cultural preferences in terms of how do you feel about yourself in relation to others? So we do these assessments to help understand, neither right nor wrong, no matter what your cultural setting was, but because of your family situation, because of your work situation, maybe the national culture you live in, you've started to believe that fixed time, for example, is a value everybody should be doing. And I would reward only those who do fixed time. I would reward only those who are direct speakers. And that works if you're in a culture that rewards that. But if you go into another culture, that may not be rewarded. So this helps you look at your unique, very unique cultural preferences. And then we will do some gap analysis to look at how you might be very fixed time, you're very fluid time. No wonder they can't get things moving on their project. And then we do some gap analysis, we do some mentoring, do some style switching, and we look at ways that we can coach and have dialogue with each other about these differences. Neither right nor wrong, but because of your acculturation, we all carry around the software in our brains. This is what I believe is of value. So let's use one example. I just pulled out a couple of the dimensions and see if any of these ring true to you. If you've ever seen a cultural gap around a couple of these dimensions. So in the interaction style, I've been using the example of fluid time versus fixed time. And all of us find ourselves somewhere on this range. Some of us may be more in the middle range, that we can go fluid time, fixed time, relatively easy. So what does fluid time mean? What do you think fluid time means? It happens when it happens, okay? And then what do you think fixed time means? What's the value there? What's that? I'll do it when I have time, okay? What about fixed time? Deadline. Time is money. If you waste a minute, you never get that minute back. So there's a very different value system. You think about that iceberg. There's a value system attached to, why is there a value attached to fixed time? What is the value to fixed time, for somebody who has been rewarded for fixed time?
In my business, there's a phrase that we use all the time, the time value of money.
The time value of money.
The interest is running.
Interest is running, exactly. So you get rewarded for that, and the value is what?
The cultural gap in my business is the time spent of people in the private sector and people in government. And government sense of urgency, except maybe in an emergency room, is not the same as ours. And I can see why they don't get the big rewards like we do in our business. And they get their salaries and their benefits and it's fixed. And they don't have the motivation to do things along, so we'll make a bigger profit.
Okay, so there's another value system that government would abide by. It's more important to have fluid time around some things because it's not so much about efficiency there, but the value is around what? What's that? The value system for government, the reason why the government would have a value system around more, it looks more fluid, it's all relative, but to the private sector it looks very fluid. What's the value system under that? Okay. Let's sit in your shoes for a minute. Okay.
I'm a senior international trade specialist with the US Commercial Service, and we help US companies export. And my view is that there may be some arms of the government move like the speed of molasses. We are very business focused, very business orientated, not bureaucratic at all. And we're basically responding to our clients just as they need them. Sometimes you can prioritize something's fluid, other times you've got a lot of fixed stuff. So I just have to defend us government grunts.
And as we're saying, these neither are right nor wrong, but there are reward systems in each of these cultural environments that and it's all relative in terms of what we see as fixed and fluid. From your point of view, you look very far apart, even on the fixed.
I'm kind of with, oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, go ahead, I'll grab right here first.
Yeah.
No, all I was going to say is there's, it seems to me you're talking about something a little bit different. To me, it's the difference in fluid versus fixed. It's the difference between marketing and sales and R&D. Okay. And I have both in my company. So we have an R&D group that is, it gets done when it gets done. It's kind of like a doctor's office. I get to you when I get to you. Versus marketing and sales are saying, look, we have to deliver. We promised it on this day.
Good. Yeah, that's a great distinction there. That we actually have a value system around fluid time because this is what you need to value the patient, value the process of research. But that's a value that's rewarded in that context.
Thank you. I work coming from Wall Street and working with government regulations, with compliance and internationally now AML. There's the market closes. So that's the fixed time.
Extremely fixed.
And the fluid is, and luckily it's, they're the people that are working on the fixed time, and then there's people working on it. And everyone has, it's clearly, the culture is clearly separated by sales versus compliance or research, like she said, on, regarding sales and research.
That's a good example. And it shows how emotionally charged these things are, right? They're under the iceberg is, what is wrong with you over there in marketing? Or what is wrong with you over in R&D? There's something that charges us emotionally. Then how do we behave with them? It works fine when we're just in our own unit, but if we have to be on a project team where it's cross-functional, we can't even get started on the project because we're defending our own cultural norm or value, just around time, for example.
And I think there's a lot of times when fixed and fluid is really just in our mind.
Say that again.
I said fixed and fluid is in our mind. What may be fixed to me is different in another culture, and it drives me crazy. Like, I was teaching in Madrid, and they wanted to eat lunch at 2 for 2 hours and drink wine, and they didn't care because they don't eat dinner till 10. Now, it doesn't mean they don't get things done and they don't meet deadlines, because this was a shipping company and very much run by deadline. But it's just the way that they operate in the day. It felt more fluid to me, but it was just the way that they did it. You know, or in Taiwan, after lunch, they all put their head down and took a nap, and I'm like, what are you doing? You know, you can't sleep on the job. But to them, it made them more productive. So I've had to learn to watch my own judgment of what I thought was fluid, and to them it was fixed.
That's a great example of what I mean. First you have the awareness, first you have the shock, then you're aware that there's a totally different value system, and it's actually quite justified. Then you begin to style switch. That takes us a little bit of time to actually style switch, because in that cultural setting, what you're going to get rewarded for, what continues to get reinforced, and what everybody starts to expect from you is that you value fluid time. And don't create a lot of conflict with your fixed time value system. But then how can you match? And then how can you pace? And how can you lead with looking at style switching and then leading with the value that there are some projects that are going to require a fixed time perspective, a fixed time code of conduct around some of these things. Neither right nor wrong, but we begin to have dialogue and create what we call a metaculture. It's a new metaculture. When you have cross-cultural or you have diverse values, you actually are creating a new cultural perspective. And you're actually coming up with new codes of conduct. Or it's all out warfare. And what we're finding is there's so much time lost on the subconscious fight around the value systems, and then there are so many practices that help us to be aware, the mindfulness, and then change our behavior and develop new skills. I had an opportunity to work in the National Science Academy had a neuroscience project, and I was invited to come in as a social scientist because I studied culture. They wanted to know what are this project was being funded by an agency in the government, wanted to know how can we read other people's minds. So you can kind of guess who the client was. What are others' intentions? And what is the science, the neuroscience telling us today? Can I read another person's mind? So this was a fascinating year-long project. I felt so honored to be a part of this group, and I was the only social scientist, so I learned a lot about the new technologies that are on the horizon. We can read your eyes, we can read perspiration, we can read your nonverbals, heart rate, exactly, the sweating, all of these things, but all of the studies that the scientists that do this, they will conclude we still cannot ever know someone else's intentions, ever. But what we're learning, and what a lot of them said, are the tools that we're learning in cross-cultural communication help us get a little better understanding of others' intentions. The first is, we need to know what our own cultural values are, because I'm only reading your value based on my own filter. So the important thing is that we learn to be mindful and to observe. This is what I've been largely rewarded for. It's a software in my brain, and now I'm going to go into a new culture, and I need to style switch. And what we've learned, many of you have probably heard this about how we change, at least 21 days. Those of you who are better at this. 21 days to change a new habit. The way the neuroscientist told me, this means you're changing neural pathways. You're actually literally changing the neural pathways in our brain. We learned and we rewarded certain behaviors and certain value systems and neural pathways in our brain a whole lifetime. So it takes 21 days to actually build those new neural pathways. That's why we need coaching, mentoring, reflection, practice. And it doesn't just happen because I say I'm going to style switch. And we may, over time, then pick up a new value. Have any of you seen that you've started out valuing fixed time, for example, and you actually came to love and you actually appreciate fluid time? Have you? I'm going to come back right there in a second. Yes, it's actually changed. Go ahead.
I just want to make two comments. First is that I think in terms of responsiveness, that size matters. You know, whether it's government or business. I mean, certainly you can get a lot more responsiveness from a small business and a small government, a small town. I moved here a long time ago from New York, and nobody called you back there. And here it was just amazing how much of an impact one person can make and have. The other thing is that Arizona has, especially the Valley, has changed dramatically since we've been here. When we first came, the only ethnic food was Mexican. Now we have so many cultural conferences and celebrations that I would encourage the people here to take them outside of their comfort zone and to go to some of these cultural conferences and also festivals, because then they can meet the people. And the other thing was that I was in a similar conference about 2 years ago, and someone from a large corporation here that had offices in China mentioned that when he went to China, I won't tell you which city or which company, he noticed that the people were taking a break and putting their head down on their home-brought pillows. They brought their pillows to work. And he said, we couldn't have that. We're an American company. And I took deference with that, and I called the president of the company, and I said, you don't understand the culture of the people that were working for you and making money for you. You need to take another look at this. So I just wanted to share that.
That's a great story to share. So it shows that we can either reward the Chinese not to bring their pillow, and you will only get rewarded in this company if you start adopting these new roles, or you can find ways to have dialogue and to actually find ways to continue to still get done what you need, but use it in a method that works for them. So let me give you an example of fixed versus fluid, and maybe you have an example of this for yourself. As I said, I grew up in Germanic, Wisconsin. Fixed time was so valuable. And that means I'm very respectful. I was rewarded from little on to respect people's time and to always show up on time and to keep my deadlines. Even if it wasn't perfect, be sure that you always turn things in. Then I had this opportunity to go to Roatan, Honduras, where fluid time was the value. Mañana does not mean tomorrow. It just means sometime, as you said. I had a very difficult time with that. And I eventually found that it's not the time or the deadline that matters so much, but it's the commitment to the relationship. And things would break down, the generator would go out, tourists wouldn't arrive on time, and everybody just said, mañana. And believe it or not, everything got done. And people enjoyed, it got done when it got done, and you get there when you get there. And we find other things to eat if the shrimp didn't arrive on time. I was so anxious. Think of the stuff under the iceberg. I had a very difficult time, and that was part of the shock. I knew this, and it's part of the reason why I wanted to move there. But thinking about it and doing it is another thing. But eventually, I came to really relax and to see the value in it and to actually pace with that. And I actually have come to appreciate so much fluid time. And I like that warmth and attention to the relationship. Even if things don't get done on time, at least there's attention to me or to the relationship. Then I came back to the United States. Highly fixed time. And then I had to style switch back to very fixed time. And I could do that, but I could still feel that pull. I really enjoyed the fluid time. So when I need to decompress, I let myself have some fluid time. I need to have that. So I was in Dubai probably 3 years ago, and I was invited to be on a radio show. And a friend of mine, a Lebanese friend, psychologist, said he would pick me up from the hotel and get me over to the radio show. So he got to the hotel, and then he said, let's just have some tea. So of course we had tea, very nice, lovely conversation, and tea. And then he started driving, he was talking, and his hands were going, and he was really enjoying our conversation, and he got lost. And I started getting extremely panicked, because I promised her I'd be there on time. It's a live radio show, and I just felt it would be so offensive. So I really had to be mindful. Calm down. My heart is racing. I'm very upset with him. I just relaxed, kept breathing into it, and eventually he got us there. And she just kept playing other things on the radio in the meantime. She's very used to fluid time. And she was happy that I came not in stressed or angry with him or angry with her or angry with myself, that I could just sit down and just enjoy a very nice radio show with them. So I guess that highlights for me that even as much as we practice, we still can get broadsided with our value attachments to some of these things. And how can we become more comfortable, and how can we lead others and use constructive behavior when we are not getting those values met in that particular setting? So that's one example. Being and doing is another great one. And we've kind of alluded to that a little bit. This focus on always doing. Some of us prefer this because we've been rewarded for it. Some of us have been rewarded for just being. That we get rewarded for more contemplation, a little more reflection, just having coffee and tea with each other instead of just grinding through the process. Have you ever worked on a team where somebody was a real beer? Just really wanted to know about your family. What did you do? How are you feeling? And then there's others who are very doers. We need to get the task done. It's very important. So again, we would have neither right nor wrong, but they have found that there's great value in just being with each other for a little while, as opposed to always being focused on doing. Can you think of a team situation? Can you think of one? They come to mind, don't they? Right before you even start to do something constructive with each other, you're starting to judge the other as being incompetent. One or the other. Insensitive. Or what? Unfocused. Right, exactly. Which brings us to the thinking style. There are some of us who really prefer multi-focus. And then there are others of us that really prefer single focus. I think we all style switch a lot to become multi-focus, but isn't it interesting? Some of us actually prefer, if we could have the luxury, I would love to just do one thing at a time. And can you feel yourself getting a little stressed? If you're a single focused person and you have to multi-focus all the time, it's very hard to always style switch, but our preference would be, I'd like to just single focus. For any of you who really prefer multi-focus, what do you think of a single focus member in your team or in your family? You're laughing about that. Something hit you really fast on that. You too. Oh, Detroit City Council. So tell us a little bit about that. Multi and single focus.
That was extremely interesting. Couldn't wait to meet.
So are you single or multi-focus, do you think?
I know I'm multi-focused.
Okay.
When the need to be, I can be single focused, because if you got to get it done, you got to get it done.
You can style switch.
But maybe I'm a multi-focused person, because if this is the issue, there are other factors that come into play. So you can't just look at the single focus all the time, because you got other things that impact you to that single focus. And that used to get real funny.
I'm glad you used the word funny. That's good, because it can be funny. Hopefully I have a little humor about this, but you said it just drove you crazy. That craziness is what's happening underneath the iceberg, how you're feeling and thinking about them, and how you're thinking about yourself. Did you want to share the one that you had? No, okay. Some of these we need to keep private. Right. Yes, ma'am.
You can't take it personal.
You can't take it
You can't take
personal.
it personal.
Exactly.
I had to get to the point, because I'm a specialist in international trade, international relations, and business. I did all the economic development analysis. I had to take the position that this is my job. Here's what I do. I gave it to them. You all make the political decision. I've done my part. And no matter how they made their final decision, which many times was wrong as heck, they take it personally.
I love that, because what you said, don't take it personally, is what I've been saying maybe in too academic of terms. Just don't take it personally. And this is very hard because this is our value system. We're highly attached to these things. How can we not take it personally? Because my identity is wrapped up into this particular value system. So I'm not going to style switch just because you say I should. I need to be motivated to do that.
I've learned to develop a different take on multi-focus versus single focus. I'm multi-focused. I've held management positions in manufacturing, marketing, and engineering. I can do it all. Go me. And I married someone who was extremely single-focused, and I see that he's allowed, because of the way his brain works and the way he manages his time, to develop a much greater expertise in the two areas that he's focused in his entire life. So I'm envious, because I can do a little bit of everything, but he can do a couple of things extremely well.
That sounds very nice. You share and appreciate his value.
We have a business and we've worked together for over 20 years. It's been wonderful.
Congratulations, that's a very nice story. It can work personally and in business as well, right? So let's talk a little bit about high and low context. I know that some of the cultural communication students here know what that is. Any of you want to tell us a little bit about thinking style of high context? What does high context mean? All right, there will be a quiz after this.
Do with how you relate to whether your decisions impact just you as the individual or the group. Is that?
It's partly, and it's how you would communicate. So you're always thinking about the group, so you probably will not say something directly, and you will speak a little, maybe you won't ever say no, but your actions, not today, and watch her actions. She's communicating with you non-verbally, and I hope you're reading it, because she's never going to say no to you. You need to read the communication in a very high context culture. A low context culture would mean that if you say you're going to do something and you do it, that's it. Don't try to send nonverbal messages, because that's not how we communicate here. I don't reward you for high context communication. Put everything in a bullet point. I don't need all the stories around it. Just give it to us straight. What do you want to say? Just say it with words or with bullet points or something very direct.
I have a very difficult time with a high context. I think it's family. I can feel my mother's emotional emanations from across the house. I can feel my husband's, and I've had to really not have my antenna up so high. It's like, if you have something that you want to communicate, open your damn mouth and communicate.
Let me just venture to guess. You're probably a very low context communicator. Okay. We like that. If we're very low context, then we appreciate that. There's a real value in that. We have a comment here.
I could actually use some help in this area. So I have a public relations firm. I'm going to Korea next week. We're talking to publishers, a client who has a book. And it's been very difficult because every time I call somewhere, nobody speaks English, and so I've been doing a lot of emailing, and the first emails I get back are, no, we're not interested, we're the least, capable people of doing this. And I got so tired of getting no's that I emailed back and said, well, can you please explain why? And now all of a sudden, they all want to meet with us. But I'm not sure, when I meet with them in person, how far to push the no and when it means yes.
Korea. Anybody has worked with Korea? You want to comment? Oh, we got lots of experts here. So this is the first thing we're going to do today, is you find a network This is exactly where we find out this kind of intelligence, is to talk to people who have worked there, and there's a lot of experiences you have right here in this room. So the fact that you all are networking is a very powerful thing, that already you know there's a difference. Now we can get to some of the subtle differences by those of you who have worked in that particular area. Did you want to add to that? Okay, you have a consultant right there. Okay, good. Go ahead.
Thank you. On going from fluid versus fixed and dealing with, like, say I grew up on Wall Street, I was secretaries to these, you know, bullpen brokers, and now I have to deal with somebody, you know, filing with the SEC on a $40 million trade, and there's spoiled brats. And then we have the firm and the SEC that's going to be filed, and nobody wants to lose any money. And what I find is if they want me to be non-threatening, I mean, I try to come from a non-whistleblower. I have to be on the same side of the table with them. So I find that if I make my fixed stuff to them as easy as possible, which sounds like something you've already done, then it makes them something. My fluid has to be their fixed.
Or, this is what we call style switching.
Yeah.
You are beginning to do the style switching. You know what you prefer, but in order to get movement, in order to get building working trust, you'll need to move a little closer to them. And first of all, you've already done several things. You have knowledge about that there are differences. You're aware now of what your preferences are. You have no idea how powerful that is, if you know what your preferences are. And then, what are the ways you can be more mindful and read the intelligence when you're there to actually watch their behavior? What do they reward over time? Let me give you one very quick story, I'll come back to you. I work a lot with consultants who work in Asia, and this particular consultant I work with goes back and forth to China all the time. He took with him an American colleague, a partner, and while they were there doing this job, they went to his father's house. His name is Marco. They went to his father's house, and on the coffee room table, he had open on the table a picture of a television set, 33 screen, whatever those large TVs are, flat screen TV, on the newspaper, on the table. When they left the house, Marco went over to an electronics store, bought that TV, brought it over to his father's house, and put it up. And his American friend said to him, "What are you doing?" He said, "Well, my father just told me he wanted a TV." We'll never tell him directly, but it's part of respect. You need to read what I've just told you. Did you see the message I sent to you? So high context will be very important for you in that particular setting. And the whole consensus-driven, depending on how that group is organized, no one individual will be able to just give you an answer. Do a little bit of cultural profiling on that firm. How much multicultural international work have they done? Are they a little more on the fixed or fluid? You could ask around a little bit and find out what their profile might be. You have a comment?
I probably don't need the mic.
Okay.
Want me to. I was going to suggest to the woman who's going to Korea that I found this in Germany also. The first answer is always no, because that's a cultural response to a different idea than they are used to, or a different kind of communication, until you earn respect and gain their trust. Secondly, you ask a good question, which is why, but I would model several questions to not make it so open-ended, but to get at more information, because it's not that they don't want to share information with you, it's that they want to know specifically what you want to know. So number one, they don't lose space in answering you, and number two, they also are a consensus culture. So they wouldn't just be able to give you an answer yes or no on their own. They would need you to come over, and then you might get a no, or we will get back to you, only because they have to discuss it without you in the room, to not lose space.
It may not be intentional to show that they're not interested, not going to talk to you directly. So just that mindfulness and patience in that situation will give you a lot of leverage. And even think of having a little bit more time spent on developing that possible relationship there. Now let's talk a little bit about control and constraint. Oh, I'm sorry.
The number of women who are working in that company and what kind of job they have. And eventually there is one who is in a high position, try to get to her. Because men over there are very, very macho.
They have a woman president now, so.
Yeah, okay, so that's very interesting. So that is going to tell you something about the culture. That may be interesting to do a little background research on that, because there's been some particular cultural change or reward system in that particular situation.
I would like to know how you tease out or confirm the difference between a perception that may be a stereotype and something that's actually true for the culture. And I'll give you an example. I was working for an attorney in San Francisco whose area of practice was community banks and savings and loan. And he had a number of Chinese American owned banks. And he was just generally lamenting about working with them. And I said, and I think there was going to be a merger or something, and he was really not happy about it. And I said, well, what's the issue? And he said that his experience was that negotiations are never over. That even if there's a signed contract, somebody always wants to reopen the negotiation. I didn't have any way of verifying that at the time, and it was only his experience. So I don't know if it's true. Where do we find out? How do we find out? Rather than just jumping in and making that assumption.
Well, you've said many, many things here. So one is, you've got a lot of resources here, and I don't know how you share with each other in terms of where some of you have been, some expertise you might have in different industries or different national cultures. That would be one way. The other is that part of this world of cross-cultural negotiation is all around not using stereotypes. Those are generalizations. What we look at, we use the terminology from anthropology. That is, when you get into some cultures, and we can look at national cultures, there are some tendencies. There are some tendencies to have a sense of more control. Everything is possible. But then there are some national cultures that believe that there's a lot of constraints. The weather, the infrastructure, religion. There are a lot of constraints that don't make it possible to do all these things you think you would like to be able to do. So one thing is, first of all, to know what your cultural preference is as these individuals are going in these regions, and then to do some cultural profiling, to take a look at many ways you can, this question you have, we talk about this a lot when it comes to the law. If you look at the law, or you look at the level of constitutional development in different national cultures, that is definitely going to change the way you think about a contract being the end versus just the beginning. So if you have a relatively weak or uncertain legal situation, you need the relationship to be able to manage that contract. So you always will be problem solving once the contract goes into place. If you have a very strong legal structure and you believe in the rule of the law and the contract, if you don't perform, you collect damages. You have the courts to uphold those particular contracts. So a lot of this ending or beginning a negotiation have a lot to do with what kind of structures are in place to uphold the agreement in the end. So that's a big part of it. And then in terms of flexibility and order, those of you who love to negotiate think that every law is flexible, right? And if some of you have a little more preference for order, one rule applies to all. And can you imagine being in a negotiation with someone who believes this rule or whatever the law is going to apply to all of us? and the other just negotiates everything. I found this when I worked in Saudi Arabia. I work a lot with companies in Saudi, and everything in the classroom was negotiable. Everything. It was exhausting, because I am very used to, this is a structure, this is what we're going to do today, we'll be done at this time. They negotiated even the time we were going to end class that day. I actually had a lot of fun with it in the end, but it was because I'm very used to a much more groups that would just take the order, believe in order, and this is the syllabus, and this is our grid, and this is what we will do each day. They had all kinds of other things that they wanted to include in it. It all worked out, but I had to style switch on my feet very quickly in that situation. So that's just an example of what I say today is the true source of power, is understanding. Is the more that you understand about yourself and the more that you understand about others, this creates so much power and leverage in a negotiation, especially when there's a lot of diversity or there are a lot of different value systems that are at stake. And I see this in great contrast to making the choice of whether I'm going to use the power of coercion to get what I want from you versus understanding myself, understanding you, your interests, your needs, and then to dialogue and actually use problem solving to accomplish what we need in this particular situation. So what I find is that this has a lot of impact on each of us personally, to think about, how do I connect with others? What's my social behavior in the way that I want to connect with others? So we think a little bit more about our behavior, rather than instinctively operating on our subconscious value system to reward or to punish others. The other is to change our thinking from being purely egoistic or protecting myself to thinking that we are actually in a relationship, that my security is inextricably linked with yours. Also, in terms of thinking about even our spiritual needs, what do I believe in? What does this negotiation represent for me in terms of my own belief structure? That all of us are operating every day on our own integrity, on our own belief structure. And if you're at odds with that in your negotiation, that's going to lead to a lot of imbalance for you, and a lot of disappointment. Also, physically, it takes so much energy to style switch and to listen to others that sometimes we have to plan ahead for some of the physical demands that come with this kind of style switching and understanding and listening and finding and crafting agreements that will reach all of our needs. And then the last is for us to really know what our feelings are. How are our feelings signposts of the way that we are thinking or what we would like to achieve in these situations? So what I find is we have this choice in every interaction. I can either go down the choice of trying to control the situation, using coercion, finding a way to manipulate, to deceive the other in order for them to do something that I want them to do. It has pretty limited utility because human beings are amazing. We want autonomy. We want to be able to make our own decisions. We need to be respected. So then we take the route of the power of understanding. And it almost feels like a free fall because we're used to thinking we can control the situation or I can control the outcome. And what I find is once we find this kind of equilibrium, how I'm thinking, how I feel, what I believe in, my physical performance, understanding my social behavior, when I have this kind of equilibrium, I have discovered that there's this state of being that really successful, very satisfied negotiators come to, and the only word I have for it is called clairvoyance. It's that you're like a buoy, you're anchored to something very deep in the water. And the white water, all of us are in these white water situations and we get tipped over all the time. But because we have actually organized the weight, we have balance in the weight of who we are in all of these dimensions, we are able to right ourselves. And to be able to manage and to understand and to lead others. And what I often find is you get incredible results. The stories people share with me are unbelievably magical. It's just magic, and I'm sure many of you have stories of this. Go ahead.
I come from a background where I'm originally from Africa, I have been to Europe and now I'm in the US. So I have the time to experience in real life all of these. And in US, I can say that generally speaking, I find out that US likes to go the other route. Well, in the part of understanding, you really find out that one thing that for instance, in Arizona, when you get a job here, they hire you and they can fire you anytime. I never understand how people can build a life on that. In Europe, you get a job, you have two types of contract, and in Africa, you have 30 years contract. Vacation, everything. And in Europe, it's the same. My cousin called me last time, he said, I'm going back to Africa to visit for 2 weeks. You want to come? I said, I don't have 2 weeks for 1 year. He said, how do you do that? I'm like, well, that's all. He couldn't understand how we live like that. Well, working in Africa or Europe, when you have an employee, he's an asset. You just don't fire him. It's an investment. You rather develop that person, switch him another post, put somebody else there, than get it fired. And I see that day-to-day in business, I don't know how they make the money, but everybody got fired and got replaced. The training, I don't know. So it brought my attention that you pretty much put it out for people that need to understand. Because loyalty, if I'm loyal to you, I will go above and beyond and give you even more than you expect. If you give me a metric, I will just meet the metric and that'll be it.
Happy you brought that up. Thank you. Thank you. So you can see that the power of coercion is alive and well. And there's so much we could talk about this. But what we are increasingly finding in our research around negotiation and leadership is that more value is created, there's higher performance, there's better health benefits when we go down this track of working with others. And what a lot of this then ultimately has to do with is finding our own clairvoyance. And how do you lead others in this particular method? So these are some of the things that I've learned. Is that I think that it's not really women per se, but feminine values of being more mindful, being more sensitive of our own situation, and being empathetic of others is a strength and quite amount of leverage in a negotiation. What I've also learned is that the more time that we understand ourselves, the more that others will be more understandable to us. Somehow we understand others better, the more we understand what really are our triggers. And the more that we understand others, the more that they help us accomplish what we want in a negotiation. And I think that's an idea that's worth spreading. Thank you very much. I probably missed some. You probably have others for me that I could put up there. Do we have time for a few questions?
Yeah, we do.
Okay, we'll take a few questions or comments that you would like to make. We didn't get to capture everybody here today. Oh, I'm sorry.
I guess my only thought on that was that there's a need for the other side too, and I'm not that way, but I'm just saying there's a need for the other side because I don't want my tax accountant to care about feelings and understanding, and I mean, there's a deadline on that, so please just file my taxes and get me my return. I don't want the military to sit there and go, hey, do you care if I take the shot? No, I don't want to hurt your feelings. So, you know, I mean, there's a reason that some people are geared that way, and I want them to celebrate that as well. That's all I want to say.
I'm really glad that you brought that up, because we're not talking about being totally nice. There's a heavy discipline on this, because understanding and protecting my rights is just as critical as caring about the other. So in the understanding track, we also protect our rights. We need to be extremely disciplined. We need to have a lot of order around what we want, what the other wants. We need to have accountability. So what I like about it, it's the best of both worlds, male values and feminine values. Coercion is a way to destroy the other so I can do better. That's not really the rights-based approach. We all need to have our rights and our interests met through the power of understanding approach. I'm glad you brought that up, because this is definitely a very disciplined, very strategic strategy where we don't give up our rights and that we don't violate others' rights in that process. We want our accountant to give us the right law. We want our lawyers to uphold, but we don't need to manipulate it. We don't need to be coercive. We don't need to use no mercy. Using our rights is a very constructive way to also look at our needs and interests in a negotiation. That's good, I'm glad you brought that up. Questions? I'll hand you the mic.
It's all very, we've got a full spectrum, so I'll take you to a counterpoint with our gentleman from Africa, just to present another side. I graduated from Thunderbird, and I've had about 25 plus years of working in over 100 countries. And as an international manager, Arizona is a right to work state. And so I think your point was very well taken in your perspective. But for another perspective, for someone who represents, let's say, a Fortune 100 company, and I've hired people all over the world, understanding sometimes you inherit people in certain regions and you think, oh my gosh, I would fire you in a minute. Because that person is impacting other layers and other activities, and if there's a responsibility to get profits back to stockholders, all those things. I've also had to make decisions, as probably many of you have, about which country to hire people in to represent regions because of the laws and the regulations. And I'm completely with you, having gone through HR to hire people, interview, the cost of really understanding what that person will bring to the organization or to the team. On the other side, sometimes country laws can make it very expensive if someone does need to be fired, and then you get into a lot of lawsuits. So there are a lot of different things to consider in the path to, we keep this person and this person needs to be dismissed, and sometimes they never do. I have many people, and in Europe, I'm very envious of them because they're in my departments and they have a lot. I have maybe 2 weeks vacation. But they have these 6-week vacations and they have lunch paid for, and I'm like, wait a minute, I'm working 16 hours a day on 24-hour time zones, so that's just a counterpoint.
This is what I love, is the beginning of a dialogue. Non-judgmental language, but just an understanding, so we can understand, and I would encourage you to continue on with this conversation. The curiosity about this. Why is it done this way? How did this happen? And you understand how the culture has been designed to begin to have these kinds of preferences and norms. Go ahead.
My topic would be completely different. My question would be, how do you find out what kind of thinking style, we talked about the time, the fixed versus fluid. How do you find out what is preferred? And how do I adjust? How do I adapt myself to it? And what do I do in the meantime while I'm in that free fall? Because I can adapt to a certain extent, I guess, to live a healthy life. I guess I can only do so much. But what do I do in the meantime to not kind of put myself in a bad spot? Because, and I've seen both sides. I'm German and I moved over here, and I do see the point of, I hope we're not always saying no, first thing. But I, in general, can support that. One of the first things that I learned, that Americans first will say, oh, I like you. Until you've done something bad to me, I will like you. And Germans are, I'll wait, and you have to prove to me that you're nice. So I can see where you're coming from. But so that would be an example. So how do I, for an organization, I'm fairly new to my organization, so it's, and there are a lot of people, so how do I find out?
Can you stay the rest of the afternoon? My favorite topic. Well, number one, I would say if you really want to get a lot of detail about the cultural orientations and actually be able to exactly know what yours are and how we can read others, this is why the classes are so great, that very systematically go through that, understanding what are some of the cultural dimensions that we could actually profile as we look at others, because we watch generally in their behavior how they behave. What do we do in the free fall? This is where I say, really get to know who you are. What are the things that you feel about these different cultural dimensions? Why are you so attached? What happened in your lifetime that made you so attached to one of the values? Neither right nor wrong, but then how do you have non-judgmental language and watch yourself in that situation and not to react instinctively, but in a mindful way to style switch and to match. You know NLP? Some of you. How do you match their style? And then how do you pace? And then how do you lead? So just matching their style, even though we're highly attached, can help you in that situation. To observe. I would say do less than more. If we're confused.
Does your company have a mentoring program where you could partner with somebody who's from America and you can help them?
That's a good idea.
It's not so much the one specifically to America versus Germany, because I've been here for quite a few years. Just came up now, and I just realized, like, wow, you know, I've always worked for smaller companies, now I'm working for a huge corporation. So there's so many, yeah, it's a completely different culture, and I'm just standing there and I'm thinking, whoa, this is just all so different for me.
Culture shock. You're in culture shock right there. Exactly.
Exactly. Something that can just, you could talk to a mentor, I think would help a lot.
Yeah. And even here in the group. One more question, comment.
I was just going to say that one of my personal observations, having been born in Central America, is that in a Latin American country, for example, you put a lot more emphasis on the personal side of the individual, as opposed to America, where we place more on the business side. Like you're saying, you know, we have deadlines to meet. I remember when I was a child, listening to the grown-ups talking and saying, you know, America is a great place to visit, but not a great place to live, because everybody's dropping dead of heart attacks because of the stress. And here I am, you know, in the business world, and I can see what they said when I was a child, and I'm thinking, you know, there is something to say about that. Now, my son just was recently accepted into Ross University in St. Kitts, and the first thing that he posted on his Facebook was, oh my God, total culture shock. People here are not moving. Everything is so slow and simple. And I said, son, just assimilate, take it all in, learn about the culture. Tell me when you come back here, you know, then you can make a comparison. But he doesn't have the experience of traveling abroad. So this is definitely a culture shock. But I can see the difference, you know, from those countries as opposed to here, where, for example, in El Salvador, which is where I'm from, in order, if you want to really get that contract, you go out to dinner with them. They're going to invite you to their home, to visit their family, to get to know everybody. So again, you make a personal contact and you got that contract, as opposed to going in there and say, here's the deadline, sign on the dotted line, and you know, it doesn't work that way. So again, learning about the cultures of other countries is very important in order to succeed in the business world.
Thank you for that. This is a great way to end with a mother's advice. I'm all for that. Be curious, stay curious, and keep learning. Thank you very much.